He had turned away the daughters of every powerful rancher in the valley, women with land deeds in their dowries and ambition dressed up as affection. Coulter Voss didn't need a wife. He needed no one. That was the story he'd been telling himself for 11 years, and he'd gotten very good at believing it. But on the worst night of that winter, when the snow came down so hard a man couldn't see his own hand in front of his face, something changed. He didn't find it in a parlor or at a Sunday social. He found it half frozen in an abandoned trapper's cabin 3 miles from nowhere, a silent little girl with hollow eyes and frostbitten fingers, alone in a way that made his chest ache in a place he thought had gone dead. If you've ever wondered what it really takes to make a family out of nothing, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't followed yet, now's the time. The Voss Ranch sat at the top of the Sable Creek Valley, like something that had been planted there by sheer stubbornness and refused to move. 4,000 acres of grass and timber and cold mountain water, bordered on 3 sides by ridgelines that turned purple at dusk, and on the 4th by a creek that ran clear and fast even in August when every other water source in the region went to mud. Coulter Voss had inherited 200 of those acres from his father, and he'd spent the better part of 20 years acquiring the rest. One hard season at a time, one bad neighbor bought out, one drought survived when others couldn't hold on. He was 38 years old and he looked it. Not in a soft way. The kind of 38 that comes from working outside in high country weather, from too many early mornings and not enough time sitting still. His face was angular and weathered, his hands permanently roughened, and he had a way of looking at people that made them feel he was measuring something they couldn't quite name. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly. He was just precise. He didn't offer much, and he didn't pretend otherwise. The rejections had become something of a local legend by the time that winter arrived. It had started with Dorothea Elgin, whose father owned the second largest spread in the valley. She'd ridden out to Voss Range on a spring afternoon under the pretense of a strayed horse, and Coulter had seen through it inside of 10 seconds. He'd been polite. He'd offered water for her animal and sent her back the way she came with nothing more than a nod. After that came the Pruitt girls. First the elder and then the younger, both dispatched with equal courtesy and equal finality. Then the Hargrove widow, who was perfectly decent and perhaps the most honest of all of them, and who had told him plainly over coffee that she needed a strong partner to hold her late husband's land. He'd respected that. He'd still said no. People in the valley had different theories. Some said he was particular to the point of being impossible. Some said he'd had his heart broken young and never fully recovered. A few of the older men, the ones who'd watched him build what he built, said the simplest thing. Coulter Voss was afraid of what marriage in this country actually meant. Not the sentiment of it, the mechanics. Every alliance he'd ever seen sold as love had eventually revealed itself to be a transaction. Family land stitched to family land, bloodlines calculated like livestock breeding records. He wanted no part of it. What he didn't say to anyone, what he'd barely said to himself, was that he'd been close once. A woman named Clara, back when he was 26 and still believed the world had a softer side he hadn't found yet. They'd talked about building something together. Then her father had come around with a proposal that had very little to do with Coulter and a great deal to do with the water rights on the eastern edge of his property, and Clara had gone along with it with a look of tired apology that told him she'd known the conversation was coming long before he had. He didn't hate her for it. He understood it too well. But something in him closed up after that, like a gate latched against weather, and the years had packed mud into the hinge until it didn't move easily anymore. He ran the ranch with 2 full-time hands, a man named Dutch Mabry, who had been with him for 12 years and who communicated mostly in short sentences and gestures, and a younger man named Theo Sandoval, who had shown up one spring looking for work and proved himself worth keeping inside of a week. Beyond that, he hired on extra labor for roundup and calving season, and he kept to himself the rest of the time. The winter that year was wrong from the start. It came 3 weeks early, which the old-timers said was a bad sign, and it came hard. Not the gradual deepening of cold that a valley could adjust to, but a sudden drop that hit in mid-October and didn't let up. By November, the creek had ice along both banks. By the end of the month, the first real storm had buried the high pastures under 2 feet of snow, and Coulter was already doing the math on feed supplies, calculating how long he could hold his herd through if it didn't break before February. The night he found Lark Rowan, he wasn't looking for anything. He'd ridden out in the late afternoon to check on a section of fence that Dutch had reported weakened by the storm's wind, a stretch along the northwestern corner of his property where the timber thinned and the elevation dropped toward the creek basin. It was the kind of task he preferred to do himself when conditions were bad, not because he didn't trust Dutch, but because seeing things with his own eyes was the only way he could actually rest afterward. He took his gray horse, Broker, who was the most sensible animal he owned, and he set out with maybe 2 hours of gray light left in the sky. The fence was worse than reported. 3 posts had been pushed clean over by a downed pine, and the wire was tangled in a way that would take the better part of an afternoon to sort out properly. He made mental notes and turned back, and that's when the snow started again. Not lightly. Within 20 minutes it was coming down in thick driving sheets, the wind picking up from the northwest and cutting through his coat in a way that was serious and getting more serious. Broker's ears went flat. Coulter pulled his collar up and kept his bearings by memory, because the light was going fast and the landmarks were disappearing under white. He nearly missed the cabin entirely. It was set back from the tree line, half collapsed on one side, a structure that hadn't been occupied in years, part of an old trapper's claim that predated his own land acquisition. He knew it was there the way you know buildings that exist on the edges of your property, which is to say, he'd been aware of it without thinking about it in a long time. What made him look was Broker. The horse slowed without being asked, ears forward, nostrils working. Coulter saw the thin line of smoke first, just a thread of it, barely visible against the pale sky, rising from what remained of the cabin's chimney. His hand went to the rifle in its scabbard, not drawing it, just checking the reflex. Then he saw the tracks. Small ones. Boot prints in the fresh snow, coming from the east, disappearing into the cabin's broken doorway. The boots had been leaking. There were wet marks inside the dry prints where the soles had failed. He dismounted and tied Broker to a broken fence post and went to the door. "Hello," he said. Not loud, just enough to carry. Nothing. He pushed the door open. The hinge gave a sound like something tearing. Inside was dark except for the fire, a small struggling thing in the stone hearth, built from scraps of broken wood and what looked like a piece of an old crate. It gave off more smoke than heat. His eyes adjusted. She was in the corner farthest from the door, pressed against the wall where 2 rotted logs met, wrapped in a coat that was far too large for her, and had probably been a man's once. She was looking at him the way a trapped animal looks at something it hasn't figured out yet. Not panicked, but entirely still, every faculty directed at assessing whether what had just walked in was a threat. She looked to be around 9 or 10, maybe small for her age. Her hair was dark and matted, and her face was pale in the firelight, except for her nose, which was red from cold. Her hands, where they gripped the edges of that oversized coat, were visibly discolored, purplish at the fingertips. Frostbite, early stage. He'd seen it before. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. She didn't answer. She also didn't move, which he took as a kind of provisional acceptance. He stepped inside and crouched down to reduce his size, which was a thing he'd learned from working with frightened animals, and which seemed applicable now. The fire was almost out. He looked around the cabin for more fuel and found a small pile of broken lumber near the hearth. She'd clearly been rationing it. "Mind if I fix that fire?" he asked, nodding toward the hearth. Still nothing, but her eyes tracked him as he moved to the woodpile and started building the fire up properly, not just throwing pieces on, but structuring it so it would catch and hold, creating the draw it needed. Within a few minutes, the heat was doubling, the smoke clearing as the chimney caught its draft. He turned back to her. "You alone out here?" A very small nod. Just barely, but he saw it. "How long?" She held up 3 fingers. 3 days. He kept his expression even because the thing he was feeling, something between anger on her behalf and a gut-level dread, was not useful to show her right now. "You got a name?" A pause. Then quietly, so quietly he almost didn't catch it. "Lark." "Coulter Voss," he said. I own the land east of here. She looked at him with an expression that said that information meant very little to her, which was fair enough. He took stock of the situation. The storm outside was not letting up. If anything, it was getting worse, and Broker was good in weather but had limits like any creature. The cabin, miserable as it was better than an hour-long ride through a blizzard with a child who was already cold-compromised. He was not going to leave her here. That was not a complicated decision. It simply wasn't one he was willing to make. Everything else that followed from it could be sorted out later. He unrolled the canvas he kept behind Broker's saddle for exactly the kind of unpredictable overnight a man sometimes had to manage in high country, and he brought in what rations he had in his saddlebag. Not much, but he had dried beef and a biscuit that had survived the ride, and a canteen that hadn't yet frozen solid. He heated the canteen near the rebuilt fire. "You eat today?" he asked. She shook her head. He held out the dried beef. She looked at it, then at him, then took it with her damaged fingers and ate it in small, careful bites, like she was trying not to look like she was hungry. He didn't watch her do it. He turned and started working on warming the canteen further, giving her the dignity of eating without an audience. "Your family around here?" he asked, his back still to her, a silence that had a different quality than the others. He turned enough to see her face. "No," she said, "just that." He didn't push it. He'd learn the rest later, or she'd tell him when she was ready, or she wouldn't, and he'd piece it together from what he could observe. That was how you got information from creatures who'd been scared badly enough to stop trusting words. They spent the night in the cabin. He kept the fire going and wrapped the canvas around her shoulders, and she slept against the wall with her knees drawn up, and Coulter sat on the other side of the hearth and dozed when he could and listened to the storm push at the walls. Broker outside made his periodic sounds of displeasure and then went quiet. By morning, the wind had dropped. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, and the sky outside the broken door was the pale, flat gray of early winter light. Coulter was sore from sleeping sitting up, and his coffee was a distant dream, and Lark was awake before him, sitting with her knees pulled up, watching the coals in the hearth with an expression of such complete self-containment that it stopped him. Most children, he thought, had a kind of ongoing noise to them, not just volume, but an inner restlessness, an expectation of being seen and attended to. This girl had none of that. She'd turned herself down to the smallest possible signal, like a lamp with the wick trimmed nearly out, and she'd been surviving on that. "Storm's done," he said. She looked at the door. "You're coming with me," he said. It wasn't a question, but he said it in a way that left space for a response. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Her eyes were gray, a particular kind of gray that had some green in it depending on the light, and they were older than her face. "You don't have to keep me," she said. It wasn't a protest. It was just a fact she was laying on the table clearly and without decoration, like she'd said it before or thought it often enough that it had become its own kind of flat certainty. "You don't have to keep me." She was making sure he understood he had no obligation, making sure she didn't owe anything to a rescue she hadn't asked for. Coulter looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from the floor and stood. "I know that," he said. "Come on anyway." She considered this for several seconds. Then she stood up, pulled that oversized coat around herself, and followed him to the door. The ride back to the ranch took 40 minutes. He put her on Broker in front of him, which the horse accepted without drama, and wrapped most of the canvas around her because the air had that particular bite that follows a storm, colder than the storm itself, with nothing left in the sky to hold any warmth. She didn't say anything for most of the ride. At some point, he felt her lean back slightly, just her shoulders making contact with his chest. Not deliberately, he thought, more the way a body eventually concedes to warmth when it's been cold long enough. He didn't make anything of it. Dutch Mabry was in the yard when they came into the gate. He looked at Broker, then at Coulter, then at the small person wrapped in canvas riding in front of him. Dutch had a face that had been trained by decades of outdoor work into a kind of permanent neutral, and it held that neutral now, but his eyes asked a question. "Found her northwest corner," Coulter said, dismounting and lifting Lark down. "Trapper's cabin, 3 days." Dutch processed this. "Alone?" "Yes." Dutch looked at Lark. Lark looked at Dutch. "I'll get Teo to start breakfast," Dutch said, and went to find him. Coulter brought her inside to the main house and had her sit near the kitchen stove while he built up the fire properly. He found a pair of his own socks, absurdly large on her, and had her put them on because her feet had been damp inside those ruined boots. He found a wool blanket. He set water on to heat and started doing what he could with the frostbite. Not much, which is what the frontier offered in these situations. Warming the fingers slowly, checking the color, watching to see whether the tissue was recovering or something worse was settling in. It looked like it would be all right. He'd gotten to her in time, or she'd gotten herself to that fire in time. He gave her credit for the fire. Teo cooked. He was young and didn't have Dutch's practiced silence, and he tried twice to start a conversation with Lark before reading the room and switching to talking at Coulter instead, which worked better for everyone. She ate what she was given, eggs and salt pork and a piece of bread, steadily and without comment, working through it with that same careful, self-disciplined pace he'd observed the night before. After breakfast, when Teo had gone out and Dutch had gone back to his work, Coulter sat at the table across from her. The house was quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the snow lay over everything, clean and flat in the morning light, and the barn's weather vane was finally still. "You don't have to tell me anything yet," he said. She looked at him. "But at some point, I'll need to know enough to figure out what's next." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother died in October, fever. We were traveling from Hendricks County, east of the pass. There was a man who was supposed to help us, a neighbor who said he had family this way. He put me on the road about 4 days out, said he couldn't feed me." She said all of this in the same flat, informational tone she'd used for everything else, not performing toughness, just reporting. Coulter put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "The neighbor," he said. "You know his name?" "Carver Bryce." She said it immediately, like she'd been keeping it. He nodded, filed it away. "And the family in Hendricks County? Your mother's people?" "My mother didn't have people." A pause. "Neither do I." He let that sit there for a minute. The stove ticked in the corner. Somewhere outside, one of the horses was knocking at its stall door. "You can stay here for the winter," he said. "It's already too deep to figure out anything better before spring, and you'd be a fool to try. After that, we can work out what makes sense." She looked at him carefully. "Why?" It was a legitimate question, and he thought about giving it a legitimate answer instead of the easy kind. "Because leaving you in that cabin wasn't something I was going to do," he said, "and I generally don't do things I'm not going to do." That seemed to be enough for her. She nodded, just once, the same minimal gesture she'd used the night before. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked out the window at the snow, and Coulter Voss sat across from her at his kitchen table in the silence of that winter morning, in the house he'd lived in alone for 11 years, and thought about the particular quality of a house that had a second person breathing in it. It was different. He hadn't expected that. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the last of the morning's pot, and didn't examine the feeling too carefully. There was work to do before dark. Lark didn't ask for much, and she didn't take what wasn't offered. That was the first thing Coulter noticed about her in those early days, and it stayed with him longer than he expected. She ate what was put in front of her. She slept in the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage since before Coulter could remember. On a cot he'd moved in there the first morning, along with a wool blanket and a spare pillow that had seen better decades. She didn't complain about any of it. She didn't ask when she could leave or what would happen to her, or what the arrangement meant. She simply existed in his house with a kind of quiet precision that was, in its own way, more unsettling than noise would have been. Dutch Mabry said nothing about it for 4 days. On the 5th day, he came in from the barn at midday and found Lark at the workbench near the back door, her small hands working at a leather harness that had split along its main strap, a repair Coulter had been meaning to get to for 2 weeks, and hadn't. She had found a needle in the wax thread without being told where it was kept, and she was running even, tight stitches through the leather with a steadiness that most grown men couldn't match on cold, stiffened hands. Dutch stood in the doorway a moment. Then he said, "You done that before." "My mother had a saddle shop in Hendricks County," she said, without looking up, "before she got sick." Dutch came in and took off his coat and hung it on the peg. He watched her work for a moment more. "You're pulling it right," he said. "Most people don't pull it right. Leave too much slack and the stitch opens up first hard use." Lark said nothing, but she pulled the next stitch with a small, deliberate tension that was, in fact, exactly right, and Dutch made a sound in his throat that was as close to approval as he generally got and went about his business. Coulter, who had been in the doorway behind Dutch without either of them noticing, went back to the yard. The frostbite healed clean, which was luck, and which Coulter acknowledged as such without making a production of it. The fingertips peeled and stayed sensitive to cold for a few weeks after, and Lark wore an extra pair of gloves out of doors during that time without being told to, which told him she was paying attention to her own body in a practical way that wasn't common in a child her age. She didn't ask for sympathy about the fingers. She didn't wince where anyone could see her do it. What she did, in those first weeks, was watch. Not in a way that felt suspicious, more the way a person watches when they're trying to understand a place, cataloging how it runs, what the patterns are, who does what and when. She watched Dutch handle the horses. She watched Teo manage the feed rotation. She watched Coulter make decisions. Small ones, large ones, the kind you make out loud, and the kind that happen in the expression on a man's face when he's standing in a field looking at something that isn't right. She started asking questions around the third week, small, specific ones. Not the chatty curiosity of a child looking for conversation, but targeted questions that told you she'd already thought about the subject before she opened her mouth. "The bay in the second stall," she said one morning, when Coulter was passing through the barn. "She's favoring her left front." He stopped, looked at the bay. A mare named Cress, who had been with the ranch for 6 years, solid and even-tempered. He hadn't noticed a change in her. "Since when?" "2 days. It's subtle. She shifts weight when she stands still, left to right, not right to left. That's the one she's not trusting." He went into the stall and ran his hand down the left foreleg. Cress stood for it. When he got to the hoof, she flinched, just barely. He picked up the hoof and found a stone fragment wedged at the edge of the frog, small enough to miss, deep enough to be causing real pressure. He worked it out with his knife. Cress exhaled when it came free, a long, slow breath that was almost eloquent. He stood up and looked at Lark, who was on the other side of the stall door watching. "How'd you see that?" "I watch how they stand," she said. "My mother said you can learn everything about an animal from how it holds still." He didn't say much after that. But that evening, when he came in for supper, he told Dutch, privately, about the stone, and Dutch said, And then after a pause, "She said something to me about the water trough on the north side. Said, the drain's not clearing right." Coulter checked the north trough the next morning. The drain had a crack along its seam that was letting cold air in from below, turning the water icy faster than it should have been. He repacked it with mortar. Problem solved. He stood there afterward in the cold and thought about a 10-year-old girl who had been on his property for less than a month and had already found 2 things that needed fixing that his 2 experienced hands had walked past without seeing. He didn't know what to make of it. He didn't try to, not yet, but something shifted in the way he thought about her presence in the house. Less provisional, less a problem being deferred until spring made it solvable. More like an adjustment being made to something that had been slightly wrong for a long time without his knowing it. Word got out, of course. In a valley where 4 ranching families accounted for most of the population and gossip moved faster than weather, Coulter Voss bringing home an orphan girl from the wilderness in a blizzard was exactly the kind of story that had legs. He heard the first version of it from a supply driver who came through in December and relayed it back to him without appearing to realize he was telling Coulter about Coulter. "They say Voss picked up some stray girl. Nobody knows where she's from. Harlan Elgin figures she's a charity case, says it's the first soft thing the man's done in a decade." "Is that right?" Coulter said. "Elgin says it won't last. Says Voss will figure out he can't run a ranch and mind a child, and he'll send her to the county in the spring." Coulter took his supplies and said nothing further on the subject, but he thought about it on the ride home. Harlan Elgin was the patriarch of the Elgin spread, the same family whose daughter Dorothea had come out on a strayed horse 3 years prior. Elgin was a man who calculated everything in terms of advantage and weakness, and the fact that he was already talking about Lark told Coulter something he filed away with the kind of quiet attention he gave to things that might become important later. December deepened and the valley settled into the hard rhythm of serious winter. The work contracted to the essential: feeding, watering, checking lines, keeping animals alive and buildings intact. Coulter found himself adjusting his routines in ways he didn't fully notice until they were already adjusted. He came in for midday meals now, which he hadn't done consistently in years. He checked the kitchen stove before bed because the room Lark slept in shared a wall with it, and the nights were getting colder. He found himself giving brief, practical accounts of what he was doing and why when she happened to be nearby, not as instruction, but more because she was clearly interested and the information was relevant. Lark, for her part, made herself useful with such methodical determination that it began to feel like something she'd decided rather than something she'd fallen into. She kept the kitchen clean without being asked. She mended what needed mending. She learned how the feed calendar worked and started tracking it on a piece of paper she pinned near the barn door, marking which animals had been fed and which hadn't with small, neat marks. Teo discovered this one afternoon and came to tell Coulter about it with an expression that was caught somewhere between amusement and impressed. "She built herself a feed log," Teo said. "I can see that. I've been meaning to do that for 2 years." "I know." Teo looked at him. "She's something, isn't she?" Coulter didn't answer because Teo was 23 and had a tendency to say things that wanted a response that confirmed the feeling, and Coulter wasn't in the habit of confirming feelings. But he thought, yes, she is. The moment things changed outside the ranch came in early January, when the weather broke just enough for travel and Coulter rode into Sable Creek Township for supplies. He tied up at the general store and went in, and came out 15 minutes later to find Percy Drummond waiting by his horse. Drummond owned the ranch to the south, a medium-sized operation that he ran with 2 of his adult sons, and which had been struggling for 2 seasons in ways that everyone in the valley knew about and nobody mentioned directly. He was a wide man with a red face that went redder when he was irritated, which was often. "Coulter," he said. It wasn't a greeting so much as an opener. "Percy, heard you've got a girl out at your place. Orphan, no family." "That's right." Drummond worked his jaw around something. "What's the plan then? You going to keep her?" "For now. County's got a home in the city," Drummond said. 3 days' ride, but the roads will be passable by March. That'd be the right thing. Proper place for a child without family." Coulter looked at him. "I'll keep that in mind." "It's just—" Drummond shifted his weight, and something in the shift told Coulter this conversation had been rehearsed, maybe workshopped with others. A man running a ranch operation that size on his own, no wife, no household, it doesn't look right, is all. People talk. "People do," Coulter agreed. He put his foot in the stirrup and mounted. "Was there anything else?" Drummond looked up at him with an expression that had a frustration in it he was trying to keep below the surface. "I'm telling you for your own good." "I understand that's how you're telling it," Coulter said, and rode out. He thought about that conversation on the way home more than he liked. Not because Drummond had said anything that touched him. The man's opinion sat roughly as heavy as a coat button, but because of the infrastructure behind it. Drummond didn't care about Lark. Drummond cared about something, and he'd used Lark as the way to raise it. That meant there were people in this valley having conversations about the Voss Ranch that were using Lark as a lens, and that was a different kind of problem from a neighbor with an opinion. He didn't tell Lark about the conversation, but he started paying different attention to the valley around him after that. What he noticed was that the watching came from 3 directions: Elgin to the north, Drummond to the south, and the Pruitt brothers to the west, who had never quite forgiven him for a water rights decision he'd won in court 4 years ago, and who had since been looking for any available angle. 3 families, none of them operating together openly, each of them with a different grievance against the Voss Ranch, and all of them now with a shared point of focus. He didn't mention any of this to Dutch, not directly, but Dutch had been in this valley long enough to read weather of all kinds. And one evening in mid-January, he came and sat at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "They're circling." "I know it," Coulter said. "Elgin's been talking to Drummond. Teo heard it at the feed store." "About Lark?" "About you. Lark's just the reason they think they found." Coulter drank his coffee. "You could send her south before March," Dutch said. "County home." Problem goes away. Coulter was quiet for a moment. Across the house, in the kitchen, he could hear the small sounds of Lark washing the supper dishes. The clink of tin, the pour of water, methodical and unhurried. She had started doing dishes 2 weeks ago without being asked. She fixed the belt drive on the water pump, Coulter said. Did you know that? Dutch blinked. No. 3 days ago. Belt had slipped its groove. She found it, put it back. Didn't tell anyone until I asked her what she'd been doing in the equipment room. Dutch said nothing. A 10-year-old found something 2 grown men walked past for a week. That doesn't change what's coming, Dutch said. He wasn't arguing, he was stating. No, Coulter agreed. It doesn't. But he didn't say he was going to send her away, and Dutch didn't push it, because Dutch had known Coulter long enough to understand that the absence of agreement was itself a kind of answer. The question of what Lark was capable of got answered in layers over the following weeks, each one a little more striking than the last. It wasn't that she was trying to prove anything. That was the part that stuck with Coulter. She wasn't performing. She was just operating, doing what made sense to her, solving what seemed solvable, and the results had a way of being noticed whether she intended them to be or not. She figured out that the hay in the northwest storage was developing mold in the lower third of the stacks, not visible from the outside. But she'd noticed one of the younger steers was refusing feed and tracked it back to the source. She drew a rough diagram of the storage layout and marked which stacks needed to be turned. Teo, who'd been feeding from those stacks for a week, stared at the diagram for a long moment and then said, "I'll be damned," quietly, to no one in particular. She started spending time with the horses in a way that was beyond what any of them had seen in someone her age. Not dramatic. She didn't have the kind of showy fearlessness that some children perform around large animals to impress adults. She was just calm with them in a foundational way, moving slowly, reading their moods, adjusting. She had a particular effect on a young roan gelding named Pitch, who had come to the ranch in the fall already spooked and had been a management problem since, resistant to leading, hard to settle in his stall, given to sudden sideways jumps that had put Teo on the ground once and nearly done the same to Dutch. Lark started going into Pitch's stall in the evenings and just sitting, not interacting, just being there. After a week, Pitch stopped flinching when she moved. After 2 weeks, he was dropping his head when she came in, which was something none of them had managed. "What are you doing with him?" Coulter asked her one evening. "Nothing," she said. "Just being somewhere he knows." He thought about that for a while. What grew between them wasn't uncomplicated, and he wouldn't have trusted it if it were. There were days Lark was closed off in a way that had teeth. She'd answer in one syllable and keep her eyes somewhere else, and whatever she was working through alone. And Coulter left her to it because he recognized the behavior from his own interior life and understood that some things don't want company. There were days he was short with her. Not unfair, but short. The way a man gets when the weight of a place is riding him and the outlet is whoever happens to be nearby. Once he snapped at her over something left on the workbench, a tool out of place, and she went still and quiet in a way that bothered him for 3 hours until he went and found her in the barn and said, "I was harder about that than I needed to be." She looked at him. "It's all right." "It's not all right, but I appreciate you saying so." She almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. He wasn't sure he'd seen a full one yet, but the corners of her mouth did something, and he took it and went back to work. February arrived, and with it, a brief warm stretch that softened the snow without fully clearing it, leaving the roads treacherous. Ice beneath slush, the worst combination for travel. It was during this stretch that Harlan Elgin came to the ranch. He came alone, which was unusual for Elgin, who typically moved with the gravity of a man who needed witnesses. He rode into the yard on a big black horse, and Coulter came out to meet him with his hands in his coat pockets and his expression easy in the deliberate way he kept things easy when he was actually paying close attention. "Harlan," he said. "Coulter." Elgin dismounted and gave the yard a long look, the kind of look that's taking inventory. "Wanted to come out and talk man to man, neighborly." "Come in then." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Coulter waited. Elgin was a man who arrived at his point through approaches, so there was no use rushing him. "I've been hearing things," Elgin started, "about how you're managing here. Nothing concerning, I want to say that up front. More like wondering about. The girl. Elgin looked at his cup. People in town have questions. Her background, her people. No offense to the child, but nobody knows where she's from or what she is. She's from Hendricks County, Coulter said. Her mother died in October on the pass road. A man named Carver Bryce left her on the roadside 4 days out. Elgin absorbed this. Bryce. Don't know the name. You wouldn't. All the same. Elgin set his cup down and looked at Coulter with the frank, measured expression of a man who is used to negotiating. She's an unknown quantity. You've got a ranch to think about. Your reputation, your operation. Folks start wondering if a man's judgment has gone soft. It affects things. Contracts, neighbors, how people deal with you. I found that the people who say something affects business usually mean it affects how they personally feel about doing business, Coulter said, which is their concern, not mine. Elgin's expression didn't change exactly, but something tightened in it. You're a stubborn man, Coulter. That's been said. I'm telling you it. I know what you're telling me, Harlan, Coulter set his own cup down. You're telling me that my keeping Lark here is making certain people uncomfortable, and that you've appointed yourself to come out and relay that discomfort with my best interests as the stated reason. I'm telling you I hear you. A pause. And I'm telling you it doesn't change anything. Elgin was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from the table and stood. You're making a mistake. Might be, Coulter said. I've made them before. He walked Elgin out and watched him ride back down the track toward the valley road, and when the sound of hooves had faded, Coulter stood in his own yard for a minute in the cold, turning things over. The visit confirmed what he'd suspected since the Drummond conversation. This wasn't about Lark. It never had been. Not really. Lark was just the handle they'd found on a door they'd been wanting to open for years. He turned around and found Lark standing just inside the barn door, watching Elgin's departure with those steady gray eyes. You heard that, he said. It wasn't an accusation. Some of it, she said. Don't let it bother you. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a child's expression and not quite an adult's either. Something in between that she seemed to occupy more and more these days. It doesn't bother me, she said. I'm used to people deciding what I'm worth before they've looked. He had nothing to say to that, because it was simply and specifically true, and she'd said it without bitterness, which made it worse somehow than if she'd said it with bitterness. Well, he said after a moment, some of them will look eventually. I know, she said, and she went back into the barn to finish whatever she'd been doing with Pitch, and left Coulter standing in the cold thinking about the particular kind of strength it took to be 10 years old and already know how the world measured people, and still get up every morning and show it what you could do. Show more. The warm stretch didn't last. By the first week of February, the temperature dropped again and the slush refroze into something uglier than the original snow. Rutted, uneven ice that made every trip across the yard a negotiation and turned the stock paths into traps for ankles, both human and animal. Coulter spent 3 days spreading sand and gravel on the worst sections, and Lark worked beside him without being asked, hauling the smaller buckets while he handled the heavy ones, neither of them talking much because the cold made conversation expensive. It was during those days, working in close proximity with little reason to perform anything for each other, that Coulter noticed something he hadn't fully registered before. Lark thought ahead, not in the daydreaming way of a child imagining futures, but in the practical, unglamorous way of someone who had learned that the next problem was always already forming while you were solving the current one. She'd sand a path, then look at where it led, and sand the connecting section before being told. She'd check the water buckets for ice, not just in the morning, but again at midday, because she'd understood that the temperature dipped in the early afternoon shadow of the western ridge. Small things. The kind of small things that, accumulated, made a place run better than it had before. Dutch noticed, too. He didn't say much about it. Dutch rarely said much about anything. But he started including Lark in his morning rounds without being asked, explaining what he was checking and why with the same brevity he used with Teo, which was the highest form of respect Dutch Mabry knew how to offer. March came in raw and difficult, the way March in the high country often did, refusing to commit to any season. The roads opened enough for traffic, and with traffic came information, and with information came the clearer shape of what Coulter had been sensing since January. It was Teo who brought the first piece of it home. He'd ridden into Sable Creek for a part they needed for the water pump, a simple errand, and came back with a look on his face that wasn't right. "Something happened in town," Coulter said. It wasn't a question. Teo unsaddled his horse and took his time with it, which was how Teo handled things he didn't want to say. Finally, ran into Will Pruitt at the hardware. He was talking to some men I didn't recognize. They stopped when they saw me, but I heard enough. "What'd you hear?" "They're saying Lark stole survey documents from the Elgin Land Office, land grant papers, boundary records. They're saying she came here because you paid her to do it." Coulter stood very still for a moment. "That's what they're saying," Teo said again. Not whispering it, saying it. Coulter looked past him toward the house, where smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney in a thin, steady line. Lark was inside. She'd been inside all morning, working on a set of account ledgers he'd asked her to organize. A task he'd given her partly because she was clearly good with numbers, and partly because the ledgers had been a disaster since he'd stopped having the patience for them 3 years ago. Who were the men Pruitt was talking to? Didn't know them. One had a badge. County, not town. That landed differently than everything else. A county badge meant this wasn't just valley gossip anymore. Someone had taken the time to reach outside the local structure and pull in a different kind of weight. Coulter sent Teo to find Dutch and told them both what he intended to do, which was ride to town himself the next morning and hear what there was to hear directly rather than through the distorted telephone of secondhand reports. Dutch said it was the right move. Teo looked relieved to have something decided. That evening, Coulter sat at the kitchen table after supper while Lark finished the last of the ledger work. She was neat with numbers in a way that surprised him every time. Not just accurate, but organized. Her handwriting small and even. Her columns properly aligned. Her totals checked against themselves with little hash marks in the margin that told you she was verifying rather than assuming. He watched her work for a while. Then he said, "Someone in town is saying you stole papers from the Elgin Land Office." Her pencil stopped. She didn't look up immediately, and in that pause he could see her processing it, not panicking, just taking it in. "That's not true," she said. "I know it's not." She looked up then. Her gray eyes were steady, but there was something working behind them, something she was calculating. "You know it's not," she said. "Or you believe me?" It was a real distinction, and she was right to make it, and he appreciated that she did. "Both," he said. "I know it's not because you've been on this property every day since December, and the Elgin Land Office is 12 miles from here, and you don't have a horse. And I believe you because I've been watching how you operate for 3 months, and lying for personal gain isn't in the way you work." She was quiet for a moment. "Elgin has survey documents?" "Every large ranch does. Land grants, boundary records, water rights filings, the paper trail behind the property. And if those documents went missing, then the ownership of the land becomes unclear, legally." He watched her face. She was getting there fast. A disputed boundary means the territory opens to claim. If someone could prove the original grant was improperly recorded or the records were incomplete, they could take the land, she said flatly. The valley, all of it, pieces of it, the valuable pieces, the water access, the high pasture, the eastern timber. You take those and the rest of the ranches bleed out slow. She set her pencil down and looked at the ledger in front of her, then back at him. "They don't actually want me," she said. "They want a reason." "They want leverage," he said. "You're convenient." She absorbed this with the same flat practicality she brought to everything difficult. No performance, no tears. Her jaw was tight, and that was the only sign. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Go to town tomorrow and talk to people directly. After that, we'll see." She nodded. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the ledgers, and Coulter didn't know whether to be relieved by that or troubled by it. He rode to Sable Creek the next morning under a sky that was thinking about snow, but hadn't committed yet. The town was small enough that his presence was noticed within 20 minutes of tying up at the post. 3 people made eye contact and then looked away, which was its own kind of information. At the general store, he got what he'd come for in terms of atmosphere. The room went a degree quieter when he walked in, and the two men at the counter near the back, one of whom he recognized as a Pruitt brother-in-law named Castle, finished their conversation too quickly. He did his business. Then he went directly to the office of the county land registrar, a man named Orrin Blatch, who had held the position for 16 years, and who was neither corrupt nor brave, which was the particular combination that made him useful to people with resources and useless to people without. Blatch was behind his desk when Coulter came in. He stood up with the energy of a man who had been expecting this visit and dreading it. "Coulter. Orrin, sit down." Coulter took the chair across the desk without being invited. "Tell me what's been filed." Blatch sat. He had the look of a man arranging something in his head, deciding what version to give. Coulter waited, because he'd found that most people who were deciding what version to give eventually gave the real one if you waited without offering them an exit. "There's a complaint," Blatch said finally, "filed 10 days ago. Alleges that survey documents belonging to the Elgin Ranch, specifically the original boundary filing from the Valley Partition of 1861, were removed from Elgin's private records. And my name is attached to this how?" Blatch looked uncomfortable. "The complaint names your property as the likely destination of the documents, based on proximity and alleged motive. Based on Harlan Elgin's say-so. Based on the complaint as filed." Coulter leaned forward slightly. "Orrin, are the Elgin documents actually missing?" The pause that followed was longer than it should have been for a yes or no question. "That," Blatch said carefully, "is the subject of some uncertainty. Meaning Elgin claims they're missing but hasn't produced evidence of their absence." Blatch said nothing, which was the same as yes. Coulter rode home thinking about that particular piece, some uncertainty, and what it meant. A complaint without concrete evidence of missing documents was a weak instrument legally, but it was a strong instrument socially, in a valley where reputation was currency and the story being told mattered as much as its truth. The complaint was designed not to hold up in court. It was designed to hold up in conversation, in feed stores and over fences, in the way people talked about Coulter Voss and the girl he'd brought home, until the accumulated weight of suspicion made it easier for him to fold than to fight. He understood that now completely. And understanding it made him angry in a slow, settled way that was, for him, more dangerous than a quick temper. The first concrete attack came 8 days later. He woke to Dutch pounding on the main house door before light, which in 11 years had happened exactly twice, both times for things that were genuinely serious. Coulter was dressed and out the door in 3 minutes. "North Water Line?" Dutch said. "Come see." The North Line fed from the creek through a buried channel to the main trough system that serviced half the herd during winter when the upper pastures were inaccessible. Coulter followed Dutch out through the dark, a lantern between them, and what he found at the intake junction stopped him cold. The intake had been blocked deliberately, not by debris, not by ice, by a fitted wooden plug driven into the pipe with enough force that it had cracked the channel wall, and then by what appeared to be a load of packed clay pushed in on top of it, sealing the line. Someone had done this in the night, on foot across his property, in freezing temperatures, which meant they'd planned it, and they'd wanted it to look like damage rather than sabotage for as long as possible. "How long has the trough been running low?" Coulter asked. "I noticed it yesterday afternoon," Dutch said. "Thought it was an ice problem in the line. Dug it out this morning." "The cattle?" "They're all right. Moved to the east trough last night when the north one dropped. But if this had gone another 2 days..." "I know." Coulter looked at the plug, at the clay, at the cracked wall. He thought about who had the knowledge of his water system to hit this particular junction, not the obvious access point at the main channel head, which anyone might guess, but the intake junction itself, which required knowing the layout of his irrigation architecture. That narrowed it considerably. He'd filed water rights documents that included a partial diagram. Blatch's office would have copies. The Pruitts had contested water rights with him 4 years ago and would have seen the filings. He repaired the line himself that day, he and Dutch and Teo working in shifts because the clay had to be cleared completely and the channel wall reseeded before refreezing could make it worse. It took 7 hours. Lark spent most of those 7 hours running water by hand to the north trough from the east supply, hauling buckets with a yoke she'd rigged herself from a piece of fence rail and 2 hooks she'd found in the equipment room because the distance was too far to manage single buckets efficiently. She didn't announce this solution. She just appeared with the yoke and started working. By the time the line was repaired and running, the light was going and everyone was exhausted and cold in the specific way that comes from wet cold work in low temperatures. Teo dropped into a kitchen chair and didn't move for 20 minutes. Dutch drank his coffee standing at the stove because sitting down would have committed him to something. Coulter sat at the table and looked at his hands, which were cracked at every knuckle from the clay work, and thought about the next move. "They'll do it again," Teo said from his chair, his eyes on the ceiling. "Different spot, maybe. Or something else entirely." "Yes," Coulter said. "So what do we do?" Before Coulter could answer, Lark said from the corner where she'd been refilling the water kettle, "What do they actually want?" 3 men looked at her. "Not what they say they want," she said, turning around. "What they actually want. Because if it's just the ranch, you defend the ranch. But if it's the valley, defending the ranch isn't enough. You'd be putting out fires while the building burns." Nobody spoke for a moment. "The valley," Coulter said. "I told you what I think this is about." "The water access and the high pasture," she said. "The eastern timber. If those 3 parcels changed hands, the remaining ranches would be dependent on whoever held them." She looked at him with that expression that had stopped being a child's expression sometime in the past 2 months. "Who holds yours right now?" "I do." "Legally? On paper, completely and cleanly?" He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, which was all she needed. "What's complicated?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Coulter looked at Dutch, who looked back without expression, which was Dutch for "this is your conversation, not mine." "The eastern timber parcel," Coulter said. "It was acquired in '81 from a man named Garrett Foss. He sold under distress, bad season, couldn't hold his note. The sale was legal and recorded, but Foss had a brother in Cheyenne who claimed afterward that Garrett had been too ill to make a competent decision at the time of signing. The claim went nowhere because the brother never pursued it formally, but the filing exists." Lark was very still. And if someone found that filing and gave the brother reasons to pursue it now, the parcel could be tied up in challenge long enough for a competing claim to be entered. You don't need to win in court if you can make the title murky enough that no bank will finance against it and no county official will confirm it. "Who knows about the Foss filing?" "Anyone who's looked at my land records." A pause. "Blatch keeps copies." She turned this over. He could almost see her working through it. Not the way a child worries at a problem, pulling pieces loose without knowing what to do with them, but the way someone thinks when they've had to solve their own problems without help for long enough that the process has become its own kind of muscle. "Then they don't need the Elgin documents to really be missing," she said slowly. "The story about me stealing them, that was just to start the conversation, to get people looking at this ranch as a place where things aren't clean. While everyone looks at that, the real work is somewhere else." Coulter felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, more like the particular clarity that comes when a problem you've been seeing in fog finally resolves into its actual shape. Ugly shape, but knowable. "That's what I think," he said. Teo had sat up in his chair. Dutch had set his coffee down. "So they fabricated a reason to investigate this property," Teo said. "And while the county badge is poking around here, someone's over at Blatch's office pulling the Foss filing and getting it in front of whoever that brother is in Cheyenne." "Or they've already done it," Dutch said quietly. The cattle stampede happened 4 days later. Coulter had moved the main herd to the south pasture for the first real melt of the season, when the grass came up from under the retreating snow in the pale, new green that cattle needed after months of dry feed. It was the right call and the right time, and he'd done it 100 times before. The south pasture was fenced on 3 sides, open to the trail on the 4th, and the cattle were calm and distributed well when he left them at midday. By mid-afternoon, they were running. Teo heard it first, that particular rolling thunder of panicked cattle, a sound that has no good interpretation, and came to find Coulter at a dead run. They got to the south pasture to find the herd pushing against the eastern fence in a mass that was going to break it inside of 2 minutes if they didn't break the pressure. Behind the herd, at the tree line, Coulter caught the motion of someone on foot retreating into the timber. One figure, fast, gone before he could get any detail. What broke the stampede was not elegant. Coulter rode hard at the leading edge and turned them the only direction available, back across themselves, buying Dutch and Teo time to get to the fence and hold it by sheer presence, horses across the gap, waving hats, making noise. The herd broke into 2 groups, circled back, and eventually slowed in the confused, heaving way of cattle that have lost the thread of their panic and don't know what to do next. 3 animals had gone down in the crush. 2 got back up. 1 didn't. Coulter stood over the dead steer in the mud and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the tree line. "Someone drove them," Dutch said, coming up beside him. "Yes." "We can't prove who." "No." They were quiet for a moment with that. "This is 3 things in 2 weeks," Teo said. He was breathing hard from the ride. "Waterline, the complaint, and now this. They're not going to stop." Coulter said nothing. He was looking at the tree line, but his mind was somewhere else, running back over everything, the sequence of it, the timing, the specific choices made. The waterline required knowledge of his system. The legal complaint required access to county filing infrastructure. The stampede required someone on foot willing to come onto his land in daylight. 3 different methods. 3 different levels of commitment. Not one person. Coordinated. He rode back to the main house in the late afternoon under a sky going orange and heavy with clouds, and he made a decision on the way that he didn't announce when he arrived, because the time for announcing things to the wrong people was clearly past. That evening, he sat down with Lark at the kitchen table after supper, after Teo and Dutch had gone to the bunkhouse, and he told her what he was going to do. She listened without interrupting, which was how she always listened. When he finished, she said, "You're going to make me your legal heir." "Yes." A pause. "That'll make them angrier." "I know." "They'll come harder." "I know that too." She looked at him across the table. The lantern between them cast her face in shadow on one side and gold on the other, and she looked, in that moment, very young and very old at the same time, which was a combination he'd noticed in her before and which always hit him somewhere he didn't fully have words for. "Why?" she asked. It was the same question she'd asked him the first morning, in the same kitchen, the same flat, honest question, not fishing for reassurance, just needing the true answer. He took a moment with it. Because whatever they're planning to do to this land, they're planning to do it by making the title look uncertain, by making it look like the ownership here has weak roots. He put his hands flat on the table. A legal heir doesn't weaken roots. It extends them. It says this place has a future that doesn't depend on me alone. And it says, clearly and on paper and in front of every county official in the territory, that I choose who carries this forward. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the wind was picking up again. "They'll say you're not in your right mind," she said. "They'll say it doesn't count. They can say whatever they like. The law says it counts. And if the law sides with them anyway, then we fight that too." Another long silence. She looked down at the table's surface, at the grain of the old wood, at the rings left by 100 cups of coffee over a decade and more. "You'd do that," she said. Not a question exactly, more like a thing she was testing the weight of. "I already decided," he said. "I'm telling you now as a courtesy because you deserve to know what's coming." She looked up. Those gray-green eyes were doing something complicated that she was keeping mostly to herself, but some of it was visible, and what was visible made his throat tighten in a way he didn't expect. "All right," she said. Just that. The same quiet, minimal thing she'd said in that trapper's cabin 4 months ago when he'd told her to come with him anyway. He rode to Sable Creek the next morning and filed the paperwork with Blatch before the man had finished his morning coffee. Blatch read it twice with the expression of someone discovering a fire in a room he'd just checked. Then he stamped it because it was legal and complete, and there was nothing in the form that gave him grounds to refuse, and handed Coulter the copy. Coulter folded it and put it in his coat and rode home. The announcement hit the valley like a stone into still water, and the rings it sent out were wide and fast and reached into places Coulter had expected and a few he hadn't. By the end of that week, the story had been retold in every feed store and saloon and ranch kitchen between the northern ridge and the county road, and each retelling added its own layer of shock or outrage or dark amusement depending on who was doing the telling. What it did, what Coulter had both intended and known to be dangerous, was force the hand of the people who'd been moving in shadows. The declaration made them visible. It gave them a target they couldn't ignore. And it told them, clearly and without ambiguity, that Coulter Voss was not going to fold. He'd known all of that when he signed the paper. What he hadn't fully anticipated was what happened when Percy Drummond rode in 3 days later with 2 of the Pruitt brothers and a man Coulter didn't recognize who had the look of someone hired for situations that required a different kind of persuasion than conversation. They came into the yard in the late afternoon, and Coulter came out to meet them with Dutch behind him, and Teo somewhere to the right that he couldn't see but knew was there. "This ends now," Drummond said. He was red-faced and not hiding it. "You pull that filing, Coulter, today." "No," Coulter said. "You don't understand what you're standing in front of." "I think I do." Drummond looked past him at the house. The implication in that look was clear, and it landed on Coulter's chest like a weight. "The girl is the problem," Drummond said. "She's been the problem since you dragged her in here. Send her away, and we can talk like reasonable men." "We're past talking like reasonable men," Coulter said. "You passed that point when you blocked my water line and ran my cattle." Drummond's red face went a shade darker. "You can't prove—" "Not yet," Coulter said. "But I'm a patient man." The man Coulter didn't recognize had shifted his position slightly. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment of weight and angle that meant something specific to anyone who recognized the language. Coulter recognized it. So did Dutch, who moved without appearing to move, 2 degrees to the right. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, which is a long time for that kind of silence. Then a sound came from the house, the back door opening and closing, footsteps on the porch, and Lark appeared at the corner of the main building, walking with the unhurried purpose she brought to everything, holding a folded piece of paper. Every man in the yard looked at her. She crossed to Coulter and held out the paper. He took it without looking away from Drummond, then looked down at it. It was the account ledger she'd been working on, open to a page of figures he hadn't seen yet, with notations in her small, neat handwriting along the margin. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him were the 3 lines at the bottom, written in a different column, separate from the accounts, with a date and 2 names he recognized. He looked up at Lark. "The Foss filing," she said quietly. "I found a copy in the old deed box in the equipment room. The brother signed a withdrawal of claim in 1884. It's registered in Cheyenne. It means the challenge doesn't exist anymore." A pause. "Someone's been telling Drummond and the others it does." The yard was very quiet. "You knew about this," Coulter said to Drummond. His voice was even. The evenness was doing a lot of work. Drummond said nothing, and his silence was as good as a confession. "Whoever told you that filing was still open lied to you," Coulter said. "Or you already knew it was resolved and used it anyway." He folded the paper and put it in his coat beside the air document. "Either way, you've got nothing." Drummond sat on his horse with the look of a man watching a card game turn against him in the last hand. Not broken yet, but recalculating. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Coulter agreed. "It's not." Drummond turned his horse and rode out, the Pruitt brothers behind him, and the unknown man last. Teo came around from wherever he'd been and watched them go. Dutch exhaled through his nose. Coulter looked at Lark, who was watching the departing riders with her hands in her coat pockets and her face calm. "Where did you find the deed box?" he asked. "Same shelf as the ledgers," she said, "behind the feed calendars. You had it organized under miscellaneous." He looked at her. "I've been looking at everything," she said, almost apologetically. "I wanted to understand how the property was put together. I didn't think it would matter." He was quiet for a moment. The riders were gone now, just dust settling on the track. "It matters," he said. She nodded and went back inside, and Coulter stood in his yard in the cold late afternoon light and felt the shape of the fight ahead. Not smaller than he'd thought, but different. Harder in some ways, cleaner in others. They knew more now. That would count for something. It didn't mean Drummond was finished, or that Elgin was, or that whoever had organized this between the three families would accept the setback quietly. What it meant was that Lark had bought them time and information, which was exactly what they needed, and she'd done it the same way she did everything. Not with drama, not with announcement, but by watching carefully and understanding what she was looking at. He thought about what she'd said, the night he'd told her about the legal heir filing. They'll come harder. She'd been right about that. They weren't done coming. Drummond came harder, just as Lark had said he would. The deed box discovery had cost them momentum, but not resolve, and within a week it became clear that the people behind the campaign against the Voss Ranch had decided that patience was no longer their strategy. The shift was subtle at first, a coldness in town that hadn't been there before, shopkeepers who'd always been neutral now finding reasons to be busy when Coulter walked in, a supply order that came back short with no explanation offered. Then less subtle. The fence along the western boundary, the line that bordered Pruitt land, was cut in 4 places over 3 nights, clean cuts with wire snips, not the ragged tears of weather or animal. And then the most direct thing yet, a letter, delivered by a writer who didn't stop to be identified, addressed to Coulter in handwriting that wasn't Drummond's but carried Drummond's logic in every line. The letter said that the filing of a legal heir document on behalf of an unrelated minor of unknown origin was being contested as fraudulent under territorial inheritance statutes, that a formal challenge had been entered in the county court, and that pending resolution of the challenge, all land transfers and title amendments associated with the Voss property were suspended. It was signed by an attorney named Whitfield, operating out of the county seat, and it had the feel of something that had been prepared for some time and was only now being deployed. Coulter read it twice at the kitchen table. Then he set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was what he did when he was deciding how angry to let himself be. "Bad?" Lark asked. She was across the table mending one of Dutch's work shirts because the needle and thread were always nearby when her hands needed something to do while her mind was running. "Whitfield," Coulter said. "You know that name?" She shook her head. "County seat attorney. Works primarily for large land interests." He pushed the letter across to her. She read it, and he watched her face do the thing it did when she encountered new information. Very still, very focused, nothing leaking out until she'd finished processing. "They're not trying to win this in court," she said when she finished. "A challenge like this takes months to resolve. They know that." "Yes." "So they want the delay." She set the letter down. "While the title amendment is suspended, you can't legally confirm the heir status, which means if something happens to you, the ranch goes to standard territorial inheritance procedure," Coulter said, "which without direct blood family means the land gets evaluated for county disposition, which means it becomes available." She looked at the letter on the table. Her jaw was doing the tight thing again. "Whitfield would have been expensive," she said. "Someone paid real money for this." "Yes." "Elgin," she said, not quite a question. "He's the only one with the cash to retain outside counsel," Coulter said. "Drummond and the Pruitts have other resources, but not liquid money. This is Elgin's play. The others are supporting it." A silence settled over the table. Outside, Dutch and Teo were working the near pasture, their voices occasionally audible, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon that had no idea how much weight was sitting inside the kitchen. "We need to find out what Whitfield actually filed," Lark said. "Not what the letter says he filed, what's actually in the court record. I'll ride to the county seat. And while you're there," she said slowly, "someone should be looking at the mining records." Coulter looked at her. "I've been thinking about the tunnels," she said. "There are old mining claims under the eastern ridge, survey maps from before the valley was settled. I found references to them in the deed box, in the same folder as the Foss papers. If those tunnels run under the property line the way the survey suggests, they cross 3 of the major ranch boundaries, including Elgin's. What does that have to do with the land fraud?" She was quiet for a moment, working through it. "Everything in the valley is based on the 1861 partition," she said. "The original surveyor divided the land using natural landmarks, the creek, the ridge lines, the tree markers. But underground, there's a different map. The mining claims were filed on a separate registry, federal, not territorial, and they include subsurface surveys that go deeper than anything the land partition used. She paused. If there are inconsistencies between the federal mining surveys and the 1861 partition, then the original boundary lines might be wrong, Coulter said. He was sitting up straighter now. Which means any land transaction based on those lines is built on a flawed foundation. Including the parcels Elgin has been trying to consolidate, she said. If he's been buying up land based on the 1861 partition, and the federal survey shows different boundaries, then what he actually owns might be substantially different from what's on his territorial deed. Coulter picked up the letter and looked at it with different eyes than he had 5 minutes ago. He's not just trying to take what's mine, he's been building something for years. And if the foundation is wrong, the whole structure fails, she said. Everything he built on it. They looked at each other across the table. How did you find the mining survey references? He asked. In the same deed box. There were 3 folded papers tucked behind the FOSS folder that I didn't look at right away because they seemed like general survey material. But the markings weren't territorial. They were federal. Different notation system, different dating format. I didn't understand what I was looking at until I'd read enough of the territorial records to see what was different. He thought about her spending her evenings with the deed box, working through documents that most adults wouldn't have the patience for, building a picture of the valley's legal architecture from the ground up. He thought about a 10-year-old girl with a saddle shop education and a survival-sharpened mind, sitting by a lantern after supper, methodically understanding something that Harlan Elgin had spent 20 years and considerable money trying to make incomprehensible. "Where are the mining surveys now?" he asked. "I put them back," she said. "I can bring them." She went to the equipment room and came back with 3 papers, folded, old, the creases gone soft with age. She spread them on the table, and Coulter leaned over them, and what he saw took him several minutes to fully absorb. The federal mining surveys were detailed in the way that federal work of that period often was, meticulous, cross-referenced, with elevation markers and subsurface readings that the territorial surveyors simply hadn't attempted. And where the 2 survey systems overlapped, there were discrepancies. Small ones in most places. Not small in 2 places. On the eastern ridge, the federal survey placed the subsurface boundary nearly 40 yards east of where the 1861 partition put it at the surface. And along the northern water access, the land that controlled flow from the high creek into the valley below, the federal measurement placed the genuine watershed line a significant distance from where the territorial deed described it. 40 yards in one direction, the watershed line in another. 2 seemingly minor discrepancies that, if documented and presented correctly, would mean that Harlan Elgin had been operating based on boundary assumptions that were not supported by the most authoritative survey on record. It would mean his water rights filings were based on a line that didn't exist where he said it did. It would mean years of land acquisitions and consolidations and legal complaints made, in reference to the 1861 partition, were built on measurements that federal record contradicted. Coulter straightened up slowly and looked at Lark. If we can get these authenticated by a federal surveyor, the county court case becomes secondary, she said. Whitfield's challenge is based on territorial statutes. Federal survey authority supersedes territorial. This doesn't just defend us, Coulter said. He was hearing the shape of it now, the full thing. This dismantles what they built. Lark nodded, then she said, "But we need someone to take it seriously, someone with standing to submit it." That was the problem, and they both knew it. A document only had power if the person presenting it was credible. Coulter had standing in the valley, but he also had the appearance of a man with obvious interest in the outcome. What he needed was someone outside the conflict who could bring the mining surveys to the federal land office independently. He thought about who that might be. The next morning, before Dutch and Teo were up, he told Lark he'd be back in 2 days. He rode north for 4 hours, past the Elgin boundary, past the tree markers that the 1861 partition had established, up into the northern reach of the valley where the country opened into a broader basin, and a small settlement called Riley Flats occupied a bend in the upper creek. In Riley Flats, there was a man named August Crane. Crane was 61 years old, a former federal land agent who had retired to the flats 8 years ago and now kept a small house and a large garden and wanted no part of anyone's business. Coulter had met him twice, once in a professional context, once by accident at a trail junction, and had formed the impression of a man with absolute integrity and absolutely no patience for anything that wasted his time. He found Crane in the garden, doing something to a section of fence with pliers and a focused expression. "Voss," Crane said without looking up, "you'd better have a good reason." "I've got mining surveys," Coulter said. "Federal, 1858, and I need someone who can verify them who isn't from this valley." Crane looked up then. He had pale eyes and a face like weathered stone and an expression that gave nothing away. "Show me," he said. Coulter showed him. They sat at Crane's kitchen table for 2 hours while the old federal agent went through the surveys with a thoroughness that would have impressed even Lark, cross-referencing the notation system, checking the dating marks, holding the paper to the light to look at the fiber composition that indicated age and origin. He said very little during this process. He made small marks in a notebook. He asked 3 questions, precise, technical questions that Coulter answered as well as he could and deferred on where he didn't know. At the end of 2 hours, Crane set the surveys down and looked at Coulter. "These are genuine, Ositit," he said. 1858 Federal Survey work, consistent with the notation protocols of that period and the regional office that would have handled this territory. A pause. "And they're inconsistent with the territorial partition in 2 significant locations." "Yes." "You understand what this means for the valley?" "I do." Crane was quiet for a moment. "Who knows you have these?" "One other person." "Elgin?" "Not yet." Crane looked out his window at his garden for a long moment. Coulter waited. "I'll submit a verification request to the Federal Land Office in the capital," Crane said finally. "As a former agent, I have standing to initiate a discrepancy review. It'll take 4 to 6 weeks for a response, but the initiation itself goes on record immediately." "That's enough," Coulter said. "The record is what I need." He rode home with something that wasn't quite relief. The situation was still dangerous, and 4 to 6 weeks was a long time when people were cutting fences and filing fraudulent court challenges. But it was footing, real footing, the kind you could build a defense from. He was 2 miles from the ranch when he saw the smoke. Not the thin domestic smoke of the kitchen chimney. This was heavy and dark and rising fast from the direction of the eastern pasture, and his stomach dropped before his mind had finished identifying it. He pushed Broker into a run. The eastern hay storage was burning. 2 of the 3 storage structures were already well involved when he came over the rise. The old timber frames catching with the particular enthusiasm of wood that had been drying for decades. Dutch and Teo were there ahead of him, forming a bucket line from the nearest trough. But the fire had too much of a head start, and the wind was carrying embers toward the 3rd structure in a way that made Coulter's throat tighten the moment he saw it. Lark was on the roof of the 3rd structure. She had climbed up with a wet canvas. He didn't know where she'd gotten it, didn't have time to ask. And she was pressing it against the leading edge of the roof where the first embers were landing, smothering them before they could catch. She was 11 years old, and she was on a burning building's neighbor in a high wind, and she looked terrifyingly competent doing it, which was almost worse than if she'd looked frightened. "Get down!" he shouted. "Not yet," she called back. An ember landed 2 feet from her, and she was on it with the canvas before it had finished glowing. He went up the side of the building. There was a loading ladder on the far end, and got onto the roof and went to her and took the canvas from her hands without discussion and told her to get down, and this time she did, because the ember situation was shifting as the wind changed, and what she'd been managing was becoming unmanageable. He spent 30 minutes on that roof while Dutch and Teo kept water on the base of the structure, and the 2 burning barns collapsed into themselves 40 yards away. When the wind finally shifted fully and the ember shower moved off, he came down with his coat singed along the left shoulder and his hands raw from the canvas, and found Lark standing in the yard watching the ruins smolder. 2 barns lost, the 3rd saved, with roughly half this season's hay stores intact, the other half gone. He stood in the yard and looked at the damage and did the math without wanting to. Feed costs, replacement structures, the timing relative to the spring herd needs. And the math was bad. Not catastrophic, but bad. "Someone said it," Dutch said. He was standing a few yards off, black with smoke. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Coulter said. Same person as the water line. Or someone hired by the same person. Coulter looked at the ruins. This was designed to hit the feed supply before spring, make it look like the ranch can't sustain the herd through the transition season. Which would give Elgin grounds to argue financial distress, Lark said from behind them. Her voice was even, but she had soot on her face, and her hands and her eyes were red from smoke. A ranch in financial distress is more vulnerable to forced sale proceedings. Both men looked at her. I read the territorial property statutes, she said, without apology. All of them. There's a provision for county-administered sale when a ranch owner can't demonstrate financial viability over a full season cycle. Someone's been planning this for months. Longer, maybe. Coulter looked at her. Her red eyes, her soot-covered face, her hands that had been on a burning roof 30 minutes ago, and felt something in his chest that was anger and something else in equal measure. The something else was harder to name. It sat behind his sternum like a coal, warm and specific. The third barn, he said. That was you. I saw it going, and I had the canvas from the equipment room, she said. It wasn't a boast. It was just an account of events. You could have been killed. The embers weren't bad yet when I went up. Lark. She looked at him. The red-rimmed eyes were steady. Thank you, he said. She nodded, once, and looked back at the smoldering ruins. They spent the next 2 days working the damage, assessing what remained, calculating how to stretch the surviving feed stores through the season. It was grim, methodical work that left no room for anything except the problem in front of you, which was perhaps merciful because it kept Coulter from spending too much time on the larger picture and its many points of pressure. On the third day after the fire, something changed in the valley. Not suddenly, but in the way that things shift when information gets ahead of the story that's been controlling it. It started with a woman named Hedda Castle, the wife of the Pruitt brother-in-law Theo had seen in the hardware store. Hedda ran the valley's informal information network, which operated through the Quilting Circle and the Ladies' Aid Society, and a general willingness to talk to everyone, and she had apparently decided sometime around the morning after the barn fire that what was happening on the Voss Ranch was not sitting right with her. Hedda came to the ranch. Not to Coulter, to Lark. She arrived in the yard on a Tuesday morning with a basket of food and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is prepared to stand by it, and she asked to speak to the girl. Lark came out wary but composed, and Hedda looked at her for a moment with the assessing look of a woman who is used to reading people quickly and accurately. You found something in those land records, Hedda said. It was direct in a way that caught Lark slightly off guard. Yes, Lark said. My husband was in that yard when Percy Drummond came out here, Hedda said. He told me what happened, what you brought out. She set the basket down on the porch rail. He also told me what Drummond said to him on the ride back. A pause. I don't think my husband is a bad man, but I think he's been told a story, and the story isn't right, and men who've been told a wrong story can do wrong things while believing they're doing right ones. Lark said nothing, waiting. What are you going to do with what you found? Hedda asked. We've already started, Lark said. There's a federal review being initiated. Hedda absorbed this. Will it be enough? It'll be enough to show what's been built on, Lark said. Whether that's enough for people to act on, that depends on whether people want to know the truth or whether they've decided the story they have is more convenient. Hedda looked at her for a long moment. You're 11 years old, she said. Yes, Lark said. You talk like someone much older. I've had reasons to. Hedda left the basket, bread and salt pork and a jar of preserved peaches, and rode back toward the valley road, and Lark watched her go from the porch. Theo, who had been near enough to hear most of it, came and stood beside her. You think she'll talk? He asked. She already is, Lark said. That's why she came. She needed to know what she was talking about was true. Hedda did talk, and talking was what Hedda Castle was best at. Within a week, the story circulating in Sable Creek had new elements that hadn't been in the previous versions. Federal surveys, boundary discrepancies, the Foss filing withdrawal that someone had been misrepresenting to Drummond and the Pruitts, the mining records that predated and superseded the territorial partition. The people who heard it didn't understand all of it, and some of them didn't want to believe it, but the sheer specificity of it carried weight that general accusations didn't. This wasn't rumor. This was documentation, and people who work land understand, in a fundamental way, what documentation means. The cracks in the coalition between Elgin, Drummond, and the Pruitts had been forming since Drummond's confrontation in the yard. What Hedda Castle's campaign of careful, specific truth-telling did was widen those cracks into something that couldn't be closed. Drummond came to Coulter, not with riders, alone, on a mid-April morning, riding slowly into the yard with his hat in his hands in a way that was as close to concession as a man like Drummond could manage while still sitting on a horse. "I didn't know about the Foss withdrawal," he said. "When they told me the claim was still open—" "I believe you," Coulter said. He did, mostly. "Who told you?" Drummond's jaw worked. "Elgin's lawyer, Whitfield. Whitfield told you the Foss challenge was still active, knowing it had been resolved in '84. He showed me a document. I thought it was the filing." "He showed you the original filing," Coulter said. "Not the withdrawal. One document without the other tells a different story." Drummond looked at his hat brim. He was a big man who suddenly seemed less so. "I cut that fence," he said quietly. "The western line. My boys did the water line." A pause. "I didn't know about the fire." Coulter believed that too. The fire felt like Elgin's method, not Drummond's. Drummond was a man who pushed boundaries literally. Fences, water. Elgin thought in abstractions, in leverage, in the kind of damage that looked like circumstance. "You'll put that in writing," Coulter said. "What you just told me. With your name on it." Drummond looked up. That's what it costs," Coulter said. "You can decide what it's worth to you." Drummond rode away without answering, but 2 days later a sealed envelope arrived at the ranch by his hired man, and inside it was a signed statement in Drummond's handwriting that was not eloquent but was specific, and it had the weight of something that had cost the man who wrote it more than he'd expected. The Pruitt brothers, when they heard Drummond had written a statement, spent 48 hours deciding whether to defend Elgin or themselves, which was the choice the situation ultimately reduced to. They chose themselves, as people generally do when the pressure is specific enough. They didn't write a statement. They were smarter than Drummond in some ways, more careful. But they sent word through Hedda Castle's network that they were withdrawing support from any further actions against the Voss property, which accomplished the same structural result. Elgin was alone now. And alone, he did what cornered men with resources do. He escalated. The federal survey verification from Crane's submission was still weeks away, and Elgin's attorney Whitfield filed 3 additional motions in the county court during that period, each one designed to extend the legal uncertainty surrounding the Voss title amendments while the federal process ran its course. It was a rearguard action, and Whitfield clearly knew it. The filings had the feel of someone buying time rather than winning ground, but it kept Coulter in a defensive posture that was wearing and expensive. It was during this period that Lark asked to go into the mining tunnels. She'd been studying the federal survey map and the deed box documents together, building a composite picture of what lay under the eastern ridge, and she had identified something that she said needed physical verification before it could be useful. Coulter said no. She explained her reasoning. He said no again, more slowly. She laid the survey map on the table and showed him exactly what she was looking for, and exactly which tunnel entrance she intended to use, and exactly what she expected to find, and the specificity of it was, in the end, what changed his answer. "I go with you," he said. "Of course," she said, which told him she'd already assumed that. The tunnel entrance was in the eastern ridge, accessible through a collapse of old timber framing that had been there so long it had grown into the hillside and was easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. Lark knew what she was looking at because she'd noted the location from the survey map and cross-referenced it against the visible terrain during her time working the eastern fence line. They went in with 2 lanterns and the survey map and a measuring line. The tunnel was old mine old, rough-cut stone, shored with timber in various stages of decay, low enough that Coulter had to duck in places. It smelled of cold rock and deep earth and time. What Lark was looking for was a survey marker. Federal survey teams of that period had set stone markers at critical boundary points, including subsurface ones where tunnels ran through contested terrain. The marker for the northern water access, the one that would establish the true watershed boundary, should be, according to the 1858 map, approximately 200 yards in and 30 feet below the ridge surface. It was there. A dressed stone set into the tunnel wall at shoulder height, with the Federal Survey notation carved into it, and a date, 1858. The boundary reading scratched into the stone in the precise notation of a government surveyor was unambiguous. The watershed line was where the federal map said it was, not where the 1861 territorial partition had placed it. 31 yards of difference. 31 yards that included the primary water rights to the upper creek flow. Lark touched the carved notation with her fingertips. The lantern light made shadows in the carved letters. "This is it," she said quietly. Coulter looked at the stone marker in the tunnel wall. This thing that had been sitting in the dark under the valley for 26 years while men above it argued about water and land and whose deed said what. He thought about what Elgin had built his campaign on. He thought about the filings and the motions and the attorney from the county seat and the men who'd come into his yard. "We need a photograph," he said, "and a witness." They came back 2 days later with August Crane, who walked into the tunnel behind them with the careful step of a man who had stopped being young but had not stopped being thorough, and who spent 40 minutes with the marker, examining it, measuring it, cross-referencing the notation against his own copies of the 1858 Federal Survey Protocol, before straightening up and looking at Coulter in the flickering lantern light. "This marker is original," Crane said, "undisturbed. The notation is consistent with Federal Survey practice of the period, and the boundary reading it records is inconsistent with the 1861 territorial partition in a way that cannot be attributed to measurement error. Then the water rights, as the Federal Survey supersedes territorial partition under the Land Authority Act of 1855, Crane said. The correct boundary for the upper watershed is as marked here, not as recorded in the territorial deed. He looked at the marker once more. Elgin's water rights claims are based on the wrong line. It wasn't loud, the moment when things fell apart for Harlan Elgin. There was no confrontation in the yard, no riders sent away. What happened was quieter and more thorough. August Crane's official federal verification report reached the territorial capital 3 weeks later, and the county court received a copy. And Whitfield withdrew all pending motions within 48 hours of that copy's arrival without explanation, which was the most honest thing Whitfield had done in the entire proceeding. Elgin did not come to the Voss Ranch. He sent his ranch foreman with a single communication, not an apology, not a concession, just a statement that the Elgin family was withdrawing all claims and complaints related to the Voss property and its title amendments. The foreman delivered it to Coulter in the yard, handed over the envelope, and left at a pace that suggested he'd been told to make the delivery brief. Coulter opened the envelope and read the single page inside. Then he went into the house. Lark was at the kitchen table with the survey maps, still working, still building her picture of the valley as it actually existed, rather than as a generation of territorial deeds had described it. She looked up when he came in. He held out the letter. She read it, set it down on the table between the survey maps. "Is it over?" she asked. "The legal part," he said. She looked at the letter for another moment, then back at the maps. "The boundary discrepancy affects 6 ranch deeds in the valley," she said. "Not just Elgin's. When the federal review is complete, everyone who holds land adjacent to the upper watershed will have to reconsider their water rights." "I know. That's going to be a long process." "Yes. The valley's going to need someone who understands the federal survey system and the territorial records both," she said. "Someone who can sit down with each affected ranch and help them understand what's actually on their land." Coulter looked at her. 11 years old, soot-stained hands from a barn fire she'd half saved, survey maps spread in front of her like she'd been studying them her entire life, which in a way she had, because every hard thing she'd survived had been its own kind of map reading. "I expect so," he said. Outside, Dutch and Teo were in the yard, doing the ordinary things, Dutch at the water trough with a wrench, Teo checking the mended fence line. The sounds of work that continued regardless of what the county court decided or what Elgin wrote in his letters. The ranch going on the way ranches do, through damage and winter and fire, and everything that people with bad intentions could bring to bear against it. Lark folded Elgin's letter and set it aside and went back to her maps. And Coulter went to make coffee, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window the way it had come through it for 11 years. Indifferent to all of it, warm on the floor, not asking what anything meant. The spring that followed was not an easy one, and Coulter hadn't expected it to be. Peace, on the frontier, didn't arrive clean. It arrived the way a wound heals, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks that made you doubt the progress until one morning you noticed the thing had closed and you couldn't remember exactly when it happened. The valley in the weeks after Elgin's withdrawal was like that. Technically settled, practically still raw. The federal review process that August Crane had initiated moved at the pace of government work, which is to say it moved with the urgency of a river in August. Present, technically flowing, but not something you'd call fast. Letters went to the Capitol. Letters came back requesting additional documentation. Crane answered them with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 30 years inside that machinery and understood that the only way through it was through it. Coulter contributed what was asked of him, signed what needed signing, and tried to run a ranch in the meantime. The ranch needed running badly. The 2 lost hay barns had created a feed deficit that bit hard through April, when the grass was coming up but hadn't come up enough to carry the full herd without supplemental feed. Coulter bought hay at prices he didn't like from a seller 2 valleys east, the only seller willing to extend credit on a ranch whose title was still technically under federal review. And he did the math every few days, and the math was never comfortable. Dutch didn't say anything about it. Teo said too much, in the anxious way of someone who wants to help and doesn't know how, until Coulter told him gently that worrying out loud made the hay situation neither better nor worse, and that his energy was better spent on the cattle. Lark watched all of this. She had a habit now of sitting with the ranch accounts in the evenings after supper. Not because Coulter asked her to, but because she'd made the ledgers her project in February and couldn't seem to let them go. She tracked every purchase, every sale, every debt extended, and every debt called. She didn't comment on the numbers unless she had something specific to say, which was often more than he expected. One evening in late April, she set the ledger down and said, "The northern water access is going to matter more than people realize." Coulter looked up from the harness he was mending. "Say more." When the federal review confirms the watershed boundary, every ranch in the valley that draws from the upper creek is going to have to renegotiate their water agreements. Most of them have informal arrangements, handshake deals that reference the territorial boundary lines. None of those lines will hold once the federal survey is official. She put her hand flat on the ledger. But your water rights, confirmed under federal survey, will be the cleanest title in the valley. That's leverage. "I'm not interested in leverage over neighbors," he said. "Not leverage over them," she said. "Leverage for them. You could offer to anchor the renegotiation. Set a fair water-sharing structure before anyone else does, while your standing is the clearest. If you write the framework, you control whether it's fair or not." A pause. Elgin was going to write the framework. That was always the plan. Consolidate the water rights under one holding and set the terms. You can do the opposite. Make it equitable and put your name on it before he has a chance to recover. Coulter set the harness down and looked at her across the table. There were moments like this that had become more frequent over the spring. Moments when Lark said something that required him to adjust how he was seeing the situation. Not because he'd been wrong, exactly, but because she was seeing further along the road than he'd been looking. It was disorienting in a way he hadn't found a way to describe, partly because it came from an 11-year-old and partly because it was so consistently right. "How long have you been thinking about this?" he asked. "Since we came out of the tunnel," she said. When Crane read the marker, "I knew then that the fight about the Voss Ranch was the small part. The water was always the real thing." Elgin knew it too. "Yes," she said, "but he wanted to own it. You could choose to share it." He thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. He thought about what Elgin had been building. That slow, patient accumulation of leverage, buying land, filing claims, maneuvering neighbors into dependency. He thought about the difference between a man who controls a resource and a man who manages one. The distinction seemed philosophical until you lived in a valley where water determined everything, and then it was the most practical thing in the world. He started writing letters in May, not to the county court or the federal land office. Those were Crane's domain now. He wrote to the ranchers. To Drummond first, because Drummond had at least been honest enough to write his statement, and because Drummond's land touched the Upper Creek in two places. He outlined what he was proposing: a water-sharing agreement anchored to the federal survey boundaries, equitably apportioned by acreage and seasonal need, administered collectively rather than by any single holding. Drummond's reply came in 12 days. It was short and not warm, but it said yes. And a yes from a man who had cut your fence 3 months ago was a particular kind of yes that meant something. The Pruitts took longer. They sent questions, careful, legal-sounding questions, that told him they'd had someone read the letter before responding. He answered each question specifically and in writing. They said yes in the third week of May through an intermediary who was clearly embarrassed to be serving that function. He didn't write to Elgin. He thought about it and decided against it, not out of hostility, but because Elgin's situation was different. The Federal Review's eventual confirmation would likely require Elgin to file corrected deed records and renegotiate water rights agreements on his own initiative under the oversight of the Territorial Land Office. That process would be difficult and expensive and public, and Coulter had no role in it and no interest in making it worse. Elgin had done what he'd done. The consequences of it were now moving at their own pace, and Coulter stepping in to accelerate or soften them seemed equally wrong. What he heard, through Hedda Cassell's reliable information network, was that Elgin had dismissed Whitfield and hired no replacement, that the Elgin ranch had gone quiet in a way that felt like a ship that had taken on water and was being kept afloat by bailing rather than sailing, that Harlan Elgin was still there, still present, still running his operation, but with the particular deflation of a man who had overplayed a hand he'd spent years building and now had to sit with the result. Coulter felt no satisfaction about this. He would have expected to, and the absence of it surprised him slightly. He'd spent months under sustained attack from the man. He had every reason to feel some satisfaction. What he felt instead was something more like fatigue, and behind the fatigue, a tired recognition that Elgin had spent enormous resources and moral compromise pursuing something that wouldn't have made him happy even if he'd gotten it. More water, more land, more paper confirming his dominance over a valley he already lived in. The accounting of it, when you laid it out, was bleak. He thought about that sometimes when he was out on the range and the morning light was doing its thing over the high country, and the cattle were moving right, and the creek was running clear and loud from spring snowmelt. He tried to think about what Elgin had wanted, really wanted, behind the strategy. He couldn't get further than power, which is what people usually want when they can't name what they're actually missing. He didn't know what he himself had been missing, exactly, before December. He'd had a working theory of himself as a man who needed nothing, which had been convincing enough to maintain for 11 years. The theory had started failing so gradually he hadn't noticed it until it was already in pieces. In June, the Federal Review returned its preliminary findings. Crane rode down from Riley Flats to deliver them in person, which Coulter took as a measure of their significance. They sat at the kitchen table, Crane, Coulter, and Lark, while the old federal agent read through the official language with the pacing of someone who knew how to extract meaning from bureaucratic prose. The findings confirmed the 1858 survey markers as authoritative. The watershed boundary was established at the federal survey line, not the territorial partition line. All water rights claims based solely on the 1861 partition in the affected area were required to be refiled within 60 days referencing the corrected boundary. The Voss Ranch's water rights, which had been filed in 1879 using landmark references rather than the partition lines, a choice Coulter's father had made for reasons that had seemed merely cautious at the time, were confirmed without amendment because they'd been correct all along. Crane set the document down and folded his hands on the table. "It's a complete vindication," he said, "on every substantive point." Lark was reading her copy of the findings. Crane had brought two, with the focused expression she brought to all documents, moving through it line by line. "The 60-day refiling period," she said without looking up. "That's tight for Elgin." "Yes," Crane said. "His current water rights filings reference the partition line exclusively. Refiling within 60 days with corrected references will require him to acknowledge the boundary error formally on the record. Which means acknowledging that his water access has been overstated, Coulter said, by approximately 17% of his claimed allocation based on the corrected line. 17% of a large ranch's water allocation was not nothing. It wasn't ruinous, but it was the kind of reduction that changed the math on a cattle operation run to the edge of its capacity, which Elgin's had always been. The style of a man who expanded right up to the boundary of what his resources could support, then pushed slightly past it and counted on things working out. Coulter thought about saying something magnanimous about Elgin and couldn't find words that weren't either hollow or dishonest, so he said nothing. After Crane left, Lark sat at the table for a long time with the federal findings in front of her. It was an evening in early June, long light coming through the western window, the sounds of Dutch finishing up in the barn drifting in from outside. The kitchen smelled like the soup that had been on the stove since noon, and the particular clean smell of old paper and the coffee Coulter had made at midday and not finished. "It's really done," she said. She wasn't asking. "The legal part is done," he said, which was what he'd said before, but with different weight this time. She looked at the window. The light was the color of old brass, thick and horizontal in the way June light gets in the early evening in high country. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." She was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from her usual silence. Less a thinking silence, and more the silence of someone who has already thought something through and is deciding whether to say it. "You don't have to keep me," she said. He recognized those words. She'd said them in an abandoned trapper's cabin in December, in the dark, with frostbite on her fingers and a stranger's lantern the only light. She'd said them the same way then, not asking to leave, not hoping to stay, just putting the fact of her independence on the table with both hands open, making sure there was no confusion about whether she was owed anything. He looked at her for a moment. "I know that," he said, which was what he'd said then too. She looked back at him, and for the first time in the months he'd known her, her composure had something fragile underneath it. Not broken, not even close, but present. Visible. Like a seam in otherwise solid material that told you where the pressure had been longest. "I mean legally," she said carefully. "The air filing, that was strategic. I understood that. You did it to protect the ranch and complicate their attack, and it worked. You don't have to—" She stopped. Started again. "I can go south in the summer. Roads are clear now. The county home is—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. He got up from his chair and went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, which was what he did when he needed something to do with his hands during a conversation that mattered, and he set one in front of her. She'd started drinking coffee in March, weak, with a great deal of the canned milk he kept for it, and he'd stopped commenting on this and sat back down. "The air filing wasn't strategic," he said. She looked at him. "It was the truth with paperwork on it," he said. "I said so at the time, and I meant it at the time. And 5 months of watching you save this ranch from burning down hasn't changed my opinion." Her hands were around the coffee cup. She was very still. "You're 11 years old," he said. You fixed my water pump, my harness, my feed rotation, my barn door that's been sticking for 4 years. You read every piece of paper in my equipment room and understood what it meant. You went into a tunnel and found a stone marker that cracked Harlan Elgin's life's work at the base." He paused. "And you got on the roof of a burning building with a canvas because that's what needed doing." She made a small sound that was not quite a word. "The county home," he said, "is 3 days south on a road you'd have to travel alone, to a place that doesn't know you, run by people who'll see a girl with no family name and a worn coat and assign you a category." He held his coffee cup and looked at it. "I'm not going to do that." A silence that had texture to it, not empty, dense with things neither of them had the exact words for. "It's not a comfortable life here," he said, which was as close as he could get to honesty about himself. "I'm not easy to live with. I'm short when I'm under pressure, and I go quiet when I should probably talk, and I've spent 11 years running this place like a man who needs no one, which doesn't make me the easiest person to be around." "I know," she said. "It wasn't unkind. But you've been here through the worst of it," he said, "and you're still sitting at that table." She looked at the table surface, then back up at him. I could stay, she said. The tentativeness in it was one of the only genuinely tentative things he'd ever heard from her, and it cost her something to say it. He could tell. Yes, he said. You could. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a ceremony. It was two people at a kitchen table in the long June light, acknowledging what had already become true somewhere in the months between a blizzard and a federal land review, without either of them having planned it. Which is how most of the important things happen, if you're paying attention. Not with trumpets, but with a quiet shift in the way a room feels when the right person is in it. Dutch, when informed the next morning that Lark was staying, said, and went back to what he was doing. Teo said, finally, and then immediately looked like he regretted how much that single word had revealed about how long he'd been wanting to say it. The water-sharing agreement was finalized in July, signed by Coulter, Drummond, both Pruitt brothers, and two additional Valley ranchers who'd been waiting to see which way things settled before committing. Hedda Cassell attended the signing in Sable Creek as a witness, which had not been strictly necessary and which she had arranged for herself because she wanted to see it happen, and nobody in the room had the nerve or the desire to tell her she couldn't. The document was 41 pages, thorough, specific, with water allocations tied to acreage and seasonal flow measurements, rather than to boundary lines that may or may not reflect the actual ground under the valley. It was the kind of agreement that took argument off the table for a generation because it was built on something solid enough to stand the weight of disagreement without cracking. Lark had drafted the core framework, in her neat small handwriting, on 8 pages of ledger paper, and a lawyer from the county seat had expanded it into legal language while preserving its essential structure, which he told Coulter was the clearest framework he'd seen come out of a private negotiation in 20 years. Coulter didn't tell the lawyer who had written the framework. He wasn't sure why, except that it seemed like it might distract from the document itself. And the document was what mattered. Elgin did not sign. He'd had 60 days to refile his water rights documentation under the Federal Review's directive, and he'd done so, hiring a new attorney from the Capitol who was more expensive than Whitfield and considerably more careful. The refiling had gone through. His water allocation was adjusted. He was still operating, still present in the valley, still the owner of the largest acreage on the northern boundary. But the campaign was over. The ambition had taken on water and he was bailing, and the one thing he wasn't doing was expanding. Coulter saw him once that summer, at a distance, on the county road near the northern turnoff. Elgin was in his wagon, moving south toward town. He saw Coulter, and they held each other's gaze for a few seconds across the distance, the way men do when they've been through something together that wasn't mutual and isn't over, but has reached the particular exhausted truce that passes for resolution on the frontier. Neither of them raised a hand. Neither looked away first. Then the road curved, and the wagon was gone behind the tree line, and Coulter rode on. He didn't feel triumphant. He'd expected to feel something close to it, on a day when the fight was clearly past, and the ranch was secure, and the paperwork was signed, and the valley had been reorganized around an equitable structure that would outlast all of them. He felt instead something quieter and less dramatic, a kind of settled rightness, like a building that's had its foundation repaired from underneath and now sits level for the first time in years. The feeling wasn't about winning. It was about standing on ground that was actually solid. He thought, on that ride home, about what the past 7 months had cost. 2 hay barns, a steer, money he didn't have easy, sleep regularly, a sense of safety that had taken years to build and had been systematically attacked by people with the resources to be systematic. He thought about what those months had given back, and the accounting on that side of the ledger was harder to quantify, but heavier. He thought about trust, which was a thing he'd stopped believing in as a working mechanism sometime around his 26th year when Claire's father had arrived with his water rights proposal. He'd told himself since then that the absence of trust was just clarity, that seeing people as they were, rather than as you wanted them to be, was wisdom rather than damage. He'd maintained that position for 11 years with some success, because a man alone on 4,000 acres doesn't need to trust many people, and the few he did need, Dutch, Teo, had given him no reason to revise his opinion. But what Lark had done, over the winter and spring, was different from what Dutch and Teo had done. They'd been loyal. That was a known quantity, earned over years of daily proximity. What Lark had done was trust him first, with nothing to base it on except a stranger in a doorway who hadn't shot her and had fixed the fire. She'd made a calculation the morning after the blizzard, in the gray light of that ruined cabin, and the calculation had been, this man said, "Come anyway." "I'll come anyway." And she'd built from there, incrementally, the way you build anything that's meant to last, by showing up every day and doing what the day required, without demanding guarantees about the days that followed. He'd been watching her do that for 7 months, and somewhere in the watching, the doing had become his too. He'd stopped moving through his own life with the provisional quality of a man who hasn't fully committed to where he is, and started, without ceremony, without decision exactly, moving through it as someone who had somewhere to be. That was what she'd given him. Not the ranch's security, though she'd contributed to that in ways that were documentable and real. Something harder to put on paper, a reason to be present in his own life rather than merely occupying it. He was not a man given to these kinds of reflections, and they made him uncomfortable in the way that any long look at oneself does when you've spent years keeping the mirror turned to the wall. But they were there, and they were honest, and he'd learned from watching Lark that honesty is usually cheaper in the long run than the alternative. The summer moved the way summer does in the high country, fast, bright, with the particular urgency of a season that knows it doesn't have long. The grass came in strong after the wet spring. The cattle gained weight at a rate that started repairing the financial damage of the bad winter. The new water-sharing arrangements proved, in their first season of operation, to be exactly as stable as Lark had suggested they'd be. The Drummond Ranch had a dry stretch in August that in previous years would have created a conflict over the upper creek, and instead was resolved in 2 letters between Coulter and Drummond referencing the specific seasonal provision clause in the agreement, without either man having to raise his voice or ride anywhere in anger. Drummond sent a note with the second letter. It wasn't long. It said, "My wife wanted me to say that the girl made a good piece of work with that agreement. She says, tell her so." Coulter read this to Lark at the supper table. Lark looked at her plate for a moment and then said, "That was kind of her," and went back to eating, but he could see that it landed and that it mattered and that she was working to not let it matter quite as visibly as it did. That was Lark, careful with her own reactions. He understood it. She'd learned to keep them managed because displayed reactions had historically cost her something. He hoped, in an imprecise way that he couldn't have articulated directly, that she would eventually stop needing to manage them so hard. That she'd learn, the way a place that's been safe long enough teaches you, that showing what you feel wasn't the same as handing someone a weapon. He wasn't sure he'd fully learned it himself, but he was working on it, which was more than he'd been doing for the previous 11 years. In September, 3 weeks before the first frost of the season, Lark turned 12. Coulter had asked her, in August, what day her birthday fell on, and she told him with the faint wariness of someone who wasn't sure why the question was being asked. He didn't make a production of it. He wasn't a man who knew how to make a production of things, and the ones who tried and didn't have the talent for it always produced something sadder than if they hadn't tried. What he did was ask Dutch to take the morning off from regular work and ride to Sable Creek and come back with whatever he found that seemed appropriate, which Dutch interpreted as 1 book on horse medicine that Lark had mentioned once in passing, 1 pair of good leather gloves sized for smaller hands than the adult ones she'd been using all winter, and a piece of ribbon in a color Dutch described to Teo as green, I think, which Teo reported to Coulter with an expression of delighted disbelief. They ate supper together, the 4 of them, which had become the normal configuration without anyone formally proposing it. And Coulter set the things Dutch had brought on the table after the plates were cleared and said, "September 14th then," which was the entirety of his birthday acknowledgement. Lark looked at the items on the table. She picked up the book first, turned it over, read the cover, set it down carefully, then the gloves. She put them on, both of them, and pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at them fitting properly, the way hands look when something actually fits them for a change. She didn't say thank you immediately, which meant it had hit harder than she'd been prepared for, and she was waiting until she could say it without the words sounding like something more was attached to them. He understood that completely and didn't push it. Teo raised his coffee cup. 12 years old, he said. A full year older than when you started working harder than the rest of us combined. Dutch made a sound in his throat that served, from Dutch, as a toast. Lark looked around the table at the 3 of them, and whatever she was holding back behind her expression, she let just a little bit through, enough to see. A warmth in her face that was unguarded and real, and that he didn't think she handed out easily or often. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, and they meant all of it. Later that night, after Dutch and Teo had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was quiet, and Lark was in her room, Coulter sat at the table in the dark for a while with his coffee going cold. He was thinking about something Lark had said months ago, in the early days, when she'd been explaining to him why she watched the horses the way she did. You can learn everything about an animal from how it holds still. He'd thought at the time she was talking about horses. He thought about how a man holds still when he's alone in a house he built himself, running a ranch he built himself, inside a life that is entirely constructed to specifications he set without consulting anyone else. The particular stillness of a man who has made himself into something that doesn't need much, who has organized his life around what can be controlled and minimized what can't. He'd been very still, in that way, for a very long time. He wasn't still like that anymore. The house had noise in it now, not volume. Lark was still one of the quieter people he'd ever known, but presence. The kind of presence that means a space is inhabited by more than one person's weight. He thought about what Lark had built on this ranch in 9 months, and it wasn't what people in the valley thought when they used that word. She hadn't built a legacy or a reputation or a legal structure, though she'd contributed to all of those. What she'd built was more basic. She'd built a household, the small, particular architecture of daily life shared between people who'd learned each other's rhythms, who knew who needed quiet in the morning and who checked the water trough at midday, and who would stay on a burning roof if that's what it came down to. Family is a word that gets used loosely, Coulter thought, sitting there in his kitchen in the dark. People use it to mean blood, or legal arrangement, or shared surname. He'd never had much use for it in those forms. What he understood now, sitting in a house that had been empty for 11 years and wasn't anymore, was that the word had a simpler meaning underneath those ones. It meant, this person is the reason I come home. This person is the reason I build the fire before it goes out. This person is the one I think of when something goes wrong or right or strange, the person I am unconsciously telling the story of my day to, whether I say any of it out loud or not. He'd never had that before. He hadn't known he was missing it in the specific way you miss something you can't name. He got up and checked the stove before bed, the way he'd been doing for 9 months, because the room Lark slept in shared a wall with it, and the nights were getting cold again. The stove was fine. It was always fine, usually because she'd checked it before him. He went to bed in a house that was quiet in the right way, the way that means the people in it are resting rather than absent, and slept without the particular unease that had been his companion for longer than he'd realized. The frost came, as it always did, in the 3rd week of September. The high pasture went silver overnight, and the cattle moved without being driven toward the lower pasture, where they knew the grass was still green beneath the frozen top layer. Coulter rode the fence line in the early morning cold, broker-breathing steam into the air, and the valley below him was the particular pale gold of early autumn. All that grass and timber, and the creek winking silver through it. Lark was somewhere behind him, on a line of her own. He'd given her one of the younger horses that spring, a calm bay named River, who she'd gentled herself over the winter. Pitch's transformation had been so complete that River had been straightforward by comparison. She rode out with him most mornings now, checking her section of fence, noting what needed repair, keeping track of which cattle were where, in the way you need to as the season turns and the herd management changes. She was better on horseback than most people he'd hired as adults. He came over a rise and saw her in the distance, sitting still on River at the top of the next ridge, looking out over the valley. She was small against the sky, this girl who was not small in any way that mattered, and the morning light was on her and the horse was standing easy, and the whole picture had the quality of something settled into itself. He watched her for a moment. Then he rode on. 11 years ago, he'd built something on this land with the understanding that he'd build it alone, because alone was what he trusted. He'd been right that trust was the foundation. He'd been wrong about what it required. What it required, he knew now, was not the absence of other people. It was the courage to let the right ones stay, to keep the fire going for them, to say, when it was time to say it, come anyway, and mean it past the morning, past the winter, past the legal filings and the burning barns and all the ways the world tests. Whether you meant what you said when it was easy to say it. Lark Rowan had no family name worth the trouble it had cost her. She had no inheritance, no blood claim, no place in the frontier social ledger except the one she'd written for herself in 9 months on a piece of ground that had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who understood what it was worth. The man who had rejected every rancher's daughter in the valley had not been looking for someone to claim his land or extend his line or make the right impression at the county seat. He'd been waiting, without knowing that either, for someone who would look at what he'd built and see it clearly, and choose it anyway, not because of what it offered, but because of what it asked for. It asked for work. It asked for patience. It asked for the particular willingness to stay when staying was harder than leaving. She had given him all of that, starting on a December morning in a kitchen that didn't know her yet, when she'd sat down at his table and eaten what was put in front of her and asked nothing except to be useful. He thought she'd gotten what she needed too, and he hoped she thought so. He'd never been good at saying that kind of thing directly. He was working on it. The fence line ran south and then east and then curved back toward the creek, and Coulter followed it the way he'd followed it every fall for 20 years. And the morning opened up around him the way mornings do in the high country. All that sky, all that distance, the particular silence of a place where the land is large enough to make you feel small in the best possible way. The silence was different now than it used to be. It had someone in it. He turned Broker toward home, and somewhere behind him he heard hoofbeats. River's easy canter, Lark heading the same direction, coming off her ridgeline toward the trail. He didn't wait for her. She didn't need him to. But their paths converged at the gate at the bottom of the pasture, the way they did most mornings now, and they came through it together into the yard, and Dutch was already at the barn and smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney because Teo had started the stove, and the valley was gold and cold and going about its morning business with complete indifference to what anyone thought about it. Lark pulled River up alongside him, and they walked the horses to the barn in comfortable quiet. At the barn door, she said, "The northwest fence needs one more post before the hard freeze." "I saw it," he said. "I'll do it this afternoon if you've got the posts." "I've got them." She dismounted and led River inside, and Coulter followed with Broker. And the barn smelled like horses and hay and cold wood the way it always had. And from somewhere outside, Dutch made a sound of greeting that served, from Dutch, as good morning, and the day continued. It was not a perfect life. It was not an easy one. The ranch would have hard years again, and the valley would have its conflicts, and Lark would grow up and have to decide things for herself that Coulter couldn't decide for her, and he would handle those moments with varying degrees of competence, because he was not a man who had ever been designed for ease. There would be seasons where the math didn't work, and nights where the worry sat on his chest, and mornings where he was short when he should have been patient. But the ground was solid under it. That was the thing. Whatever came, the ground was solid, and they'd laid it together, and that was not nothing. That was, in the end, the only thing that counted.